Welcome back, biology students. Today we are moving on into our study of the cells unit. Yesterday we spoke a little bit about the microscope and how its invention has led to um, a whole new field, well, several new fields, cell biology and as well as microbiology. And today we're going to talk about those scientists once again who had such an impact starting in the 1600s on our study of living things in biology. So our learning target for today is to be able to describe the key events leading to the development of the cell theory. And that's what our SOL says that we have to know. And so yesterday, remember I said that Hans and Zacharias Janssen, father and son team, actually invented a form of the microscope. And as you can see, they had a very rudimentary microscope, which was just a lens on either end connected by a tube. And so it did have an eyepiece lens, it did have an objective lens, but the image that they would have seen would have been very blurry, not really, it would have been magnified, but it wouldn't have been a clear image. So it would have had poor resolution. And so Robert Hooke, who actually invented a compound microscope where he was, or improved on the microscope, and he utilized a compound microscope where he was actually able to see individual boxes within plant matter. And this is actually cork, which is a part of the bark of a tree. And he actually saw these little individual chambers, and he believed that they looked like the chambers that monks lived in, which was basically four walls and an empty room. And so he named cells, and so that's how we got the name cells. But this was in 1665, and because of his great scientific like recording his information, we have the book Micrographia, and we're able to see exactly what he was able to see through his microscope. And so this is why it's so important to have accurate diagrams and to record your information for others to see. And because of Robert Hooke, we now have the whole entire field of cell biology. And so this is what cork looks like. You might see it in like a wine bottle. They're actually starting to make flooring out of cork. It's very durable, but it is a layer, and this thing right here is covering it up. But it's a layer of tree bark, and this is what that would look like if he shaved off really thin slices of it and he looked at it under a microscope. So remember that image associated with Robert Hooke. And then we had in 1673, Anton von Leeuwenhoek also invented and developed early microscopes and um, improved on the structure and function of the microscope from what Hans and Zacharias had. And so his microscope looked like this. And again, associate this image with Anton von Leeuwenhoek because this little tiny thing was able to view living cells for the first time. And not only that, he was able to view pond water. And so he was able to view bacteria, which are very tiny, and protists, which are also very tiny. He called them animalcules, or tiny animals. And again, we now know these as protists. He was also able to see human sperm cells for the first time. And so he is credited with developing our microbiology field. And so that's Anton von Leeuwenhoek developed an early microscope and helped create the microbiology field. And without knowing about that tiny microscopic world, we would not know about the diseases that we know about today. And I mentioned COVID yesterday, and COVID is caused by a virus, and that is even smaller than a bacteria. So without him first discovering bacteria, and then we had Louis Pasteur and figuring out that bacteria can cause disease, and Edward Jenner. And so without Anton von Leeuwenhoek utilizing that microscope to discover tiny living things, microscopic living things, protists and bacteria, that microscopic world, we would not be faring very well as a human civilization. So these were some, again, he did really well with his images and the drawings, that scientific drawings that he created as well. And so, again, a few 150 years later, we had Matthias Schleiden, who came along and he was able to view plants, and he said that plants are made of cells. And he was a botanist, so the study of plants is called botany. And so he helped to contribute to the cell theory. And then we had Theodore Swan, and Swan was actually a mortician. And he also said that living things are made of cells, but this time he said animals are made of cells. And I kind of differentiate the two because swan sounds like swan, and a swan is an animal. And so he said animals are made of cells. I kind of remember sliding because of slimy spinach. And spinach is a plant. All right, and then we also had a guy named Rudolf Virchow or Virchow. I'm not sure which way to say that, but he also helped to develop part of the cell theory. And he said that cells come from pre existing cells, or cells come from cells that are already there. And basically, he just described how cells divide to create new cells. And you have to remember what time period this was. So, this was 1858. So, remember, we had talked about spontaneous generation in the years before that, and how it was proposed that living things could come from non-living things. Well, Virchow basically, or Virchow basically, scientifically proved that cells can only come from other cells. And so together, those scientists developed the cell theory, and it was mainly these three, the last three that we just talked about, that are credited with the three parts of the cell theory. But if you notice, it took over 150, well, almost 200 years to actually develop the cell theory, from the first time we were able to see cells until we got the last part of the cell theory. So if you remember, a theory is something that is supported by lots of evidence from several different scientists. And as you can see here, we have lots of evidence, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scientists, and others that probably never got mentioned. So remember the difference between a theory that we use in everyday language and then a theory in science. So the three parts of the cell theory state that living things are made of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of life, and cells come from cells. So again, we can see which scientists help contribute to these parts. So cells come from cells, that was definitely Virchow or Virchow, who said that. And living things are made of one or more cells, that was definitely Swan and Schleiden. Swan said animals are made of cells. Schleiden said plants are made of cells. And so I'm not sure who actually came up with this part, but we now know this as a definition of cells. All right, that ends our discussion on the history of cells. There's a pretty cool video that tells you about how these scientists actually didn't get along, called The Wacky History of the Cell Theory. So please make sure you watch that. I've posted it in your Wiser Me assignment, and I've also posted it in your digital notebook. So make sure you take a chance and look at that. It's pretty interesting how some scientists who were afraid that other scientists would get their work and publish it before they would, how they actually interacted with each other.